Welcome to the tutorial on business ethics. Today the chapter is ethical decision making process. A decision making process for ethics. Ethical decision making process requires a persuasive and rational justification for a decision. And for rational justification, we need to develop a logical process. And in that logical process, we have to consider the facts, alternative perspectives, the consequences to all the stakeholders, and the ethical principles. Whenever we are applying the rational justification, we have to consider the facts, alternative perspectives, consequences to all stakeholders, and ethical principles for the decision. Steps in ethical decision making process. We can see there are 7 steps. The first one is determine the facts, and the second one is identify the ethical issues involved. Number 3, identify stakeholders and consider the situation from their point of view. Number 4, consider the available alternatives, also called using moral imagination. And number 5, compares and weigh. Weigh means evaluate. Compare and weigh the alternatives based on consequences for all stakeholders, duties, rights and principles, implications for personal integrity and character. That means we have to compare or evaluate the alternatives on the basis of consequence, duties, rights, principles, implication for personal integrity and character. And the 6th one is make a decision. Finally, monitor and learn from the outcomes. So these are the 7 steps by which we can take a ethical decision. Now we are going to see the details of the 7th step. The first step is determine the facts of the situation. So whenever we are taking ethical decision, in that case we have to consider all the facts, and determining the facts depends on the perceptual differences, and perceptual differences depends on the experience and the surrounding situations. And sometimes experiences are mediated by and interpreted through our own understanding and concepts. Unpacking our own and others' conceptual schemata plays an important role in making ethical, responsible decisions. That means perceptual difference depends on experience and surrounding situation, and this experience also depends on our own concept and others' concept. Given the general importance of determining the facts, there is a rule of science. In this case, we need to focus on critical thinking. A person who acts in a way that is based on a careful consideration of the facts has acted in a more ethically responsible way than a person who acts without deliberation. So whenever we apply the critical thinking, in that case we can apply careful consideration of the facts, and that will provide a ethical decision. Generally, the social science can help us to determine the facts surrounding our decisions. Whenever we are determining the facts, we can apply our own concepts as well as we can take help from the concepts of others, and we should consider the critical thinking to get a careful consideration of the facts. And in that case, social science help us to find out the surrounding facts. The second step in the ethical decision making process is to identify the ethical issues involved. Whenever we are taking economic decision, we have to consider the ethical consideration. We have to be sensitive to ethical issues. That means we need to ask ourselves that how our decisions will impact the well-being of the people involved, and the people means the stakeholders. And whenever we are considering the impact, we should be concerned about the impartial promotion of human well-being. Your well-being means the happiness, health, dignity, integrity, freedom, and respect of the people. So whenever we are considering the well-being of the people, in that case we have to consider the happiness, health, dignity, integrity, and freedom and respect. As well as whenever we need to focus on the ethical issues, we have to consider the environment, animals, and future generations. By focusing or considering the human well-being as well as the environment, animals, and future generations, we can take a ethical decision. Sometimes ethical decision may be difficult due to three reasons. The first reason is normative myopia. Normative myopia means whenever you are taking decisions, if you focus on the technical aspects very carefully, in that case you may fail to consider the ethical aspects. That means whenever you are too concerned about the technical aspects, you may avoid the ethical aspects, or you may miss the ethical aspects in decision making. That is called normative myopia. In that case, you will fail to consider the ethical issues. And the second reason is inattentional blindness. Sometimes we may be inattentional in considering the ethical issues. In that case, this inattentional blindness can also be a cause for failing to consider the ethical issues. The third reason is change blindness. Sometimes we don't notice the gradual change over time. In that case, our decision making will not be on the basis of gradual change, and that problem is called change blindness. For these three reasons, we may miss the ethical consideration while taking the ethical decision making. The third step in the ethical decision making process is identify stakeholders and consider the situation from their point of view. We need to consider all the people affected by the decision, and here all the peoples means the stakeholders. And we can see there is a diagram. From the diagram we can see whenever we take decisions, that decisions will provide impact on the employees, customers, local community, government, suppliers, and owners. So these are the stakeholders, and they will be affected whenever we take a decision for a business organization. One helpful exercise for considering the effects of a decision on others is to shift one's role. That means whenever you are thinking the impact, you can change your role. You can think you are the business manager, but consider yourself as an employee. Suppose you are an employee, and what would be the impact on you as an employee by the decision taken by the managers. So in that way, you can change your role and consider what would be the impact on you as an employee, or as a customers, or as a local community, or the other stakeholders. And in that way, you can take a fair, impartial, and ethical decision. Whenever we are considering the stakeholders, we need to consider the social and environmental issues. However, here the main focus is you have to consider all the stakeholders, and you have to consider how they will be affected by the decision made in the business organization. And in that case, to consider the impact or effects, you can change the role, then think what would be the impact on you as a employee, or customers, or local community, or government, or suppliers, or the owners. The fourth step in taking ethical decision is consider the available alternatives, and it is also called using moral imagination. By this moral imagination, we can apply our creativity. And whenever we consider the available alternatives, we should apply this moral imagination. And what does that mean? Moral imagination is the situation when we envision the various alternative choices and the related consequences, the resolutions, benefits, or the harms. So whenever we take decision, what are the alternative choices? We have to consider it. Then what would be the consequences for all the alternatives? And is there any resolutions from the company or from the other stakeholder side? And you need to consider the benefits and harms regarding all alternatives. And in doing so, you have to apply your moral imagination. The fifth step in taking ethical decision is compare and weigh the alternatives. Here weigh means evaluate. We need to compare the alternatives based on consequence, compare the alternatives based on duties, rights and principles, compare the alternatives based on implications, I mean the significance for personal integrity and character. And as well as we have to weigh means evaluate. We have to evaluate the alternatives based on consequence. We have to evaluate the alternatives based on duties, rights and principles. We have to evaluate the alternatives based on implications for personal integrity and character. And in that case, it would be helpful if we try to place ourselves in the other person position. That means whenever we are comparing the alternatives according to the consequences, we can change our role. We need to evaluate whether our decision will mitigate, minimize, and compensate any harmful consequences. Or on the other hand, we can evaluate whether our decision will increase or promote beneficial consequences. The sixth step in ethical decision making is make a decision. Making a decision means formulating a plan and carrying it out. That means in making a decision, we need to formulate our plan and we need to implement that plan. And in doing so, we can take help from our experiences. And the final step in taking the ethical decision is monitor and learn from the outcomes. So we can see whenever we are taking an ethical decision, we have to evaluate the implications of our decisions for the purpose of monitoring and learning from the outcomes, as well as we need to modify our actions accordingly when faced with similar challenges in the future. We need to monitor and learn from the outcomes, and we may need to modify our actions when needed. And from this experience, we need to develop a plan for preventing future crises, and we can also institute a new practice, and we should also develop a new policies and procedures, and that is called learning from the outcomes. This is the last step in ethical decision making. We should monitor and learn from the outcomes, and we need to modify our actions when needed, and by this experience we can develop a new plan, or we can start a new practice, and we can develop a new policies and procedures. There are some situations when ethical decision may goes wrong. That's why there is a issue when ethical decision making goes wrong. There is a related question: why do good people engage in bad acts? The possible answer could be that there are ignorance while taking decisions. Sometimes the decision maker may be willful and intentional to take the decision, and sometimes there may be limited alternatives. As a human being, generally we may be comfortable with simplified decision rules, and sometimes we consider minimum decision criteria. Sometimes it's easier to do wrong thing. We do not always draw the lines for appropriate behavior in advance. Maybe some issue will not be crystal clear. People also sometimes make decision they later regret because they lack the courage, and main reason of lacking courage due to peer pressure. We can see these are the issues for which some ethical decision may go wrong, or sometimes the good people engage in bad acts. Mainly we can say maybe there are limited alternatives, or sometimes we prefer to take the simplified decision considering the minimum criteria, and sometimes people may be intentional to do that wrong thing. Maybe he or she is good, but sometimes intentionally or willfully he take the decision that may be the cause of peer pressure. That's why the decision maker may lack of courage. So these are the issues. There are also another issues we can see in the next slide. We can see good people may engage in bad acts due to high levels of corporate executive compensation. Sometimes the compensation depends on the performance. So whenever executive try to increase the performance, in that case he may adopt unethical issues. Maybe he is the good person, but to achieve the high compensation he may adopt unethical fares to increase the performance to get the compensation or the bonus. And the second reason may be lack of oversight of corporate executive decisions, because the decision making is done by the higher authority. Maybe there is no one to monitor their decision making process. That's why sometimes good people engage in bad acts. Another reason may be distance between the decision maker and the people who will be affected. There is a distance. That's why the decision maker never knows what would be the impact on those people, because the affected people may not be able to contact to the higher authorities or the decision maker. And sometimes maybe there is a financial challenge and a set of ethical values that has not yet caught up to technological advances. I mean, there may be some issues where ethical issues may not be developed to cover those technical issues. So these are the issues for which good people may engage in bad acts in taking ethical decision making. Sometimes people may fail to control the temptation, because whenever you face any temptation you may succumb to it, and making ethically responsible decisions throughout one's life is perhaps the most serious challenge. These are the issues for which one good people may engage in bad acts in ethical decision making process. Ethical decision making in managerial roles. This slide will focus that most of the ethical decision depends on the managerial roles. If there is a right organizational culture and structure, then the dishonest person cannot act to fulfill their bad intention. A manager with the responsibility will behave courageously to promote the ethical behavior and to discourage the unethical behavior. Whenever a responsible manager takes decision, he should consider the implications on the personal life and the professional life. A responsible manager should consider the implications in the perspective of social life as well as the institutional life. Social life depends on the friends, son and daughter, spouse, citizen, neighbor. And if you consider the institutional life or institutional environment, we can see manager, employee, parent, child, professor, president of a student club. So these are the roles a responsible manager can play. Managers, executives and board members have the ability to create and shape the organizational context in which all employees make decisions ethically. They therefore have a responsibility to promote organizational arrangement that encourage ethical behavior and discourage unethical behavior. Decision making is done by the higher executives or the managerial persons. If they are ethical, if they create a good environment, then ethical decision making is very simple. And by this ethical decision making, we can ensure a good social and institutional life. As a ethical manager, we can take a decision which would be beneficial for the personal or professional perspective. Thank you.